2020. This is the premier flagship conference, as you all know, of the adaptation community globally. This is jointly hosted by the World Adaptation Science Program, WASP, and TERI. So on behalf of both the host organizations, really thank everyone for coming for this webinar on a particularly important and relevant topic. And we're very glad that the Green Climate Fund and the IFRC have taken the lead in putting this webinar together. These two organizations have actually been in the forefront of trying to implement and strengthen countries' early warning systems, and critically making sure that warning information is used for effective decision making. So that fits into the overall theme of the conference, which has been to link knowledge and action, and how do we make sure that knowledge and information, the right kind of knowledge and information, is generated, delivered, used, and then ultimately leads to outcomes that improve the resilience and reduce the vulnerability of those most affected. So this webinar will give us a chance to actually hear from both practitioners, funders, a very diverse array of perspectives on how to ensure these linkages between knowledge and action. So with that brief welcome, I'd like to turn over to Anya, Dr. Anya Grobicki from the Green Climate Fund for her opening comments, and then over to her for the next session.
Thank you very much, Anand, and good evening, everyone. I'd really like to thank Adaptation Futures 2020 and TERI for the opportunity to present this webinar to you today on forecasting the future. Just last week, the UN Secretary General said in the General Assembly that the climate emergency is fully upon us and we have no time to waste. Delaying climate action costs livelihoods and lives. In this accelerating climate crisis, forecasting the future accurately is becoming increasingly important to safeguard people, and especially poor people living in vulnerable communities who are hit first and hardest by climate impacts. GCF is really proud to deliver this webinar together with the IFRC to explore some of the adaptive new financing mechanisms that seek to link the forecasting with accurate assessments of the likely impacts on the ground, known as impact-based forecasting. And with that brief introduction, I would like to hand over to Martin van Aalst of the IFRC.
Thank you, Anya, and indeed, thanks to the hosts of Adaptation Futures. It's very nice to be together still, albeit in a virtual form. And it's also a special pleasure to do this together with you, Anya. And it's really exciting to see where we're at with the climate world in general. I think really putting what has long been seen as a very long-term gradual change issue to practice, also addressing the shocks that we all see around us today. And the question of how we make climate information most useful, but also how we really invest in it in a way that makes the biggest tangible difference, especially for the most vulnerable countries and people, is the question we'll be addressing this afternoon. And from our side in the IFRC, with many volunteers at the front lines of the disasters, often having responded, but wanting to be able to anticipate and reduce risk in advance much more. It's a delight to be here with the biggest funders of those sorts of investments. And then to have that discussion really with everyone involved in that whole chain that is needed to make this work. So we have a wonderful program. I want to thank in advance all the presenters who are joining us. I want to thank you, the audience. There's an opportunity to chip in with your thoughts. There will be a Google Doc that we will be doing collective note-taking on, which my colleague Catalina Jaime will share, especially for during the panel later on. But I'll now first hand back to Anya for the first segment of our presentation, also outlining how the Green Climate Fund is approaching this important area of investment to deal with the rising climate risks. Anya.
Thank you, Martin. So to kick off then, we're going to be talking about the investments that the Green Climate Fund has made in climate information early warning systems, already over $1 billion worth of such projects in our portfolio. and then also the strategy that we're looking at for making the most targeted investments, making the best use of the money going forward. Because, as I said, these investments are especially important for saving the lives of people in poor and vulnerable communities. And we need to be as targeted as possible in reaching those in the most need. So with that, I'm really delighted to introduce the senior specialist in the Green Climate Fund for Climate Information and Early Warning Systems, Dr. Joseph Daniel Insiful. Joseph has, prior to working at the Green Climate Fund, he was the senior climate science expert at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. He's had a wealth of experience also working with the UNDP African Adaptation Programme. He's had a spell working at the UK Meteorology Office, working with a regional climate model called PRACY. So we're really very fortunate to have Joseph's experience and expertise in the Green Climate Fund, where he has already steered many, many projects successfully through the board. And he's also currently working on the sector guide for the climate information early warning systems. So with that, over to you, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Anya, and distinguished colleagues and participants. I feel very honored to present to you the GCF investment in climate information and early warning systems. By way of presentation, I will provide an introduction and global context, look at some of the barriers and opportunities and risks associated with climate information and early warning systems. And I will talk about paradigm shift and financial structuring of projects, and also looking at how we develop impactful projects. And then GCF investment in climate information and early warning system with some case studies. And then I'll conclude with a summary and also impact pathways that we could look forward to in designing impactful projects. And so by way of introducing, you all agree with me that climate-related disasters are on the rise, and in particular pose significant threat to the 2015 global agendas, the Paris Agreement, SDG, and the Sendai Framework. Climate information and early warning system provide robust evidence, information that enable early action, and also inform decision making on low emission climate resilient development. And so with natural disasters occurring nearly 5 times as frequent as compared to the 1970s, climate information early warning system is crucial than ever before. So to provide a bit of perspective in terms of the global context, in the last 50 years, we realized that storm floods, tropical cyclones, and droughts have caused about 3.7 million deaths, and 7.6 billion people have been affected. Global economic losses have been unprecedented. If you look at the amount of $2.4 trillion, or 0.2% of world GDP each year, and this actually pose a significant risk to development. But as if this were not problematic enough, relative to GDP, small island states, small island developing states, African countries, and LDCs bear the brunt of these damages. Costs are increasing at about $50 billion per year in 2007 to about $500 billion a year in 2016. And so it's become very clear that the cost of establishing and creating a fit-for-purpose climate information is too expensive for non-Annex 1 countries to be able to do that on their own. And this is well evident in the NDC NAPA and the NAPs that has been submitted to the convention. As a matter of fact, in 2019, 13 parties that submitted the NAP mentioned the need for climate information and early warning systems. And also 50% of the NDCs that were submitted to the Paris Agreement also mentioned the need for climate information and early warning systems. And in all this, we see the ambition is very clear, but the identification of the action that needs to be taken is really lacking, in particular in most vulnerable countries. And the quality of information, the expression of need does not really match what we observe on the ground. But more importantly, also, we see some market assessment that shows that the lowest capacity in sub-Saharan Africa, and also some growth areas in terms of sectors that drive climate information and early warning systems are actually the vibrant sectors of energy, aviation, large-scale agriculture, and resilient infrastructure. And so some of the barriers that we have identified when we look at our pipeline and portfolio is actually lack of enabling environment for institutional effectiveness. We also see lack of coverage and scale for effective delivery in terms of the quantity and quality of hard and soft infrastructure. We also see the complexity of forecasting itself and limited government finance and budgets that are allocated to the national meteorological and hydrological service, as well as the national disaster management agencies. We also see market barriers to creating enabling conditions, and more importantly, also uncoordinated interventions by various donors and players on the ground that limit the effectiveness of existing support to developing countries. But beyond the barriers, we also see opportunity. Particularly, we see growing demand that far exceeds supply. If you look at the NDCs that were submitted as part of the Paris Agreement, 77% of Africa and Middle East, 76% of Latin America, and the Caribbean, as well as 100% of Asia Pacific, indicated very clearly the need for early warning systems and climate information. And climate information and early warning system also has a very good business case. There's a lot of market potential for unlocking private sector investment and participation. As a matter of fact, studies done by WMO and the World Bank shows that for every dollar of investment in climate information and early warning system, the returns is between 2 to 36% and even more. And also growing commitment across the globe in terms of continental and national scales as expressed by the Paris Agreement, the SDG, and the Sendai Framework, indicate a growing commitment to ensure that climate information and early warning system is made widely available. And also unique opportunity to enhance coherence and complementarity of investment, as well as leverage private sector finance, public budgets, and public-private partnership. We also see opportunities in terms of the role of government, not only as a consumer, but also opportunity to sell services to generate revenue, and also to businesses and other consumers. So the dual synergy between government and GCF, we see this in the form of government providing important services to society to improve cost effectiveness while maximizing the performance of critical infrastructure. And so GCF can provide the climate information early warning system to several countries, creating a strong pipeline that also informs the design of mitigation and adaptation projects. In terms of risk, we see project development risks as part of lack of understanding of the climate rationale, particularly the social, economic, and environmental outcomes of investment in climate information and early warning systems, limited knowledge of GCF requirements that will enable the preparation of strong pipeline. We also see project implementation risk. This is also evident in terms of uncoordinated global and national action, lack of knowledge, a lack of demand in terms of disconnect between the user need and infrastructure development. But more importantly, also, we've seen that the COVID-19 has exposed the vulnerability of our global observing networks and forecasting system. As a matter of fact, lack of observation in a particular area affects the quality of the forecast and analysis across the globe. We see from COVID-19 that observation from aircraft has declined by 80% since early February and close to 90% in the tropics and southern hemisphere. Availability of surface data has also decreased significantly, especially in Africa. And more importantly, also ocean observation has declined by 80% compared to pre-COVID-19 baseline. So it's very apparent that transition to automation will improve the effectiveness and resilience of reporting to the global observing network, and particularly the global observation network and the systematic observation financing facility that is being established through the WMO and major partners like GCF will play a very significant role in ensuring that our forecasting early warning systems are resilient to any forms of disasters. And so how do we define paradigm shift in terms of climate information early warning system? We define 4 key pillars: transformational planning and programming that is underpinned by climate science that informs strategic planning and country programming. We also look at catalyzing climate innovation, using innovations such as Internet of Things, big data, cloud computing to underpin project design and create strategic partnerships, enable finance and improve policy. We also see mobilizing financing at scale as also critical in terms of innovative financing options and key partnerships to leverage and scale up investment. And more importantly, also expansion and replication of knowledge brokering through institutional collaboration, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And so we will say that climate information and early warning systems are fundamental to the design of projects. They inform the design of mitigation and adaptation projects that then will create an impact that we need in terms of low emission, climate resilient development. And in terms of financial structure, we find this to be very, very critical. There are several public and private blended financing mechanisms available that can inform access to technology improvement of forecast and response from the use of climate information early warning system. We also see public budget grants and loans to acquire infrastructure and support operations very critical, and also de-risking instruments that can enable the use of climate information in a more effective way and make them more user-driven. And more importantly, also forecast-based financing, which has become one of the de facto standards in climate information early warning system as a part of the broader risk financing architecture, which provides opportunity to reduce the potential disaster risk and insurance premiums through early action. And so how do we design impactful projects? Investment criteria is critical, particularly looking at mitigation and adaptation impact potential. We also look at paradigm shift in terms of investment in climate information and early warning system that will leverage private sector investment and enable progress. Sustainable development potential is also critical, and needs of recipient country ownership, efficiency, and effectiveness as being the core elements of designing an impactful project. And how do we also leverage on other facilities like the readiness program that the GCF used to support countries? So knowledge creation for adoption of innovative technology, such as Internet of Things, improving the policy environment, strengthening regional hydrometeorological programs, and building quality and reliable climate data and loss models that will enable the design of sector-specific application for climate risk finance. In terms of GCF investment in climate information and early warning system, today GCF has invested over $877 million, and with co-financing, this amounts to about $1.8 billion. Distribution across regions and countries, Asia, Pacific, and Africa, constitute about 85% of the portfolio. Latin America, Caribbean at 11%, and Eastern Europe 4%. In terms of country groupings, we have 74% to LDC, Africa, and SIDS, with the remaining 26% going to other developing countries. And this is very important if you look at the mandate from the Paris Agreement that calls for attention on LDC, Africa, and SIDS. It shows clearly how GCF is addressing this commitment to the convention. In terms of accredited entities, we have about 91% going to international accredited entities. So there's a lot of need to also diversify and ramp up action to support direct access entities in establishing climate information early warning systems. But I think what is also striking is the fact that 25% of the project focus on modernization of hydromet services, and 75% focus on applications in sectors, which we think this is very, very significant because climate information early warning system has no value until it is used in a particular application. So this representation within the portfolio indicates the direction that we have to go in terms of how we target interventions to address climate variability and change. For case studies, climate information and early warnings that have many outcomes across sectors, dimensions of development, and many sectors. I'll provide a few examples, particularly looking at transboundary river basins, transboundary adaptation, a project on the Niger Basin, which provides climate information to inform adaptation planning and development within the Niger Basin, which consists of highly indebted poor countries in West Africa. And also scaling up multi-hazard early warning system and use of climate information in Georgia, as well as multi-hazard impact-based forecast and early warning system for the Philippines that are critical case studies that demonstrate GCF's commitment to supporting countries to manage climate risk. But also more importantly is the fact that multidimensional impacts in terms of direct benefits of 2.3 to $46 for every dollar invested, and return of investment of about 9 to 72%. Co-benefits across the various resort areas of the GCF demonstrate the relevance of climate information and early warning system to climate action. And so, to summarize and conclude, I want to look at the impact pathways that defines how climate information and early warning system should be looked at. We realize that 25% of the project focus on modernization of hydromet services and 75% focus on sector application, which is very, very important in defining the way we have to target interventions. But then climate information services, critical for creation of relevant science-based information that will inform decision-making and enable early warning systems and creating new business opportunities that builds resilience in communities and enable revenue generation and security of life and livelihoods. And also impact-based forecasting of most importance to de-risking investment by improving resilience and also adaptive capacity while creating new and more climate resilient pathways for development. And also more importantly, investment. This climate information and early warning system for investment and financial decision making is critical. So the major focus on impact-based forecasting, forecast-based finance, and adaptation, and the broader disaster risk finance is critical. The paradigm shift to assist asset owners, both the public and private sector, the insurance companies. And so by way of summary and conclusion, these are my the thoughts in terms of the pathways that will enable us to really address the challenge that we face in managing climate variability and change. So thank you for your attention.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Joseph, for that wonderful presentation. And thank you also for reminding us that especially during this current pandemic situation, it's really important to think about linking subnational systems with the national and regional as well as global observation systems, and also the importance of moving towards automation as far as possible in order to safeguard these systems in this kind of crisis situations. Now, to respond, first of all, to your presentation, I'm now delighted to invite Mr. Kosi Latu from SPREP, the Secretariat of Pacific Regional Environment Program. So SPREP is an intergovernmental organization with 21 member countries in the Pacific Islands, countries and territories, as well as 5 developed countries. And Mr. Latu is an international environmental lawyer who's the Director General of SPREP. So Kosi, welcome. It's wonderful that you're able to join us today. And I'd really like you to kick us off, please, in this question and answer session. Tell us, how does this strategy of the Green Climate Fund meet SPREP's needs for the future and the needs of your member countries? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Anya, and thank you, Joseph, for that presentation. I appreciate the opportunity for me to speak first. It's almost 2 o'clock awake while making a presentation, but Anya, what I might want is just maybe, if you allow me, just maybe respond to 1 or 2 very important points that Joseph made, because I think it sets a very good context for hopefully discussion later on, and then I could make some observations from our experience in terms of Joseph's presentations, if that's okay. The information I think that Joseph has, as I said, sets a very good context in terms of the work that SPREP is trying to do in the Pacific, in terms of helping countries to enhance their early warning systems. One of the things that we have found with member countries, of course, when you're talking about member countries, we have a mixture of some are metropolitan countries, but in particular, the focus is on these small SIDS, small island states. There's over 30,000 of these small island states in the Pacific, many of which are disconnected from one another. You can find almost every barrier that Joseph has mentioned in his presentation in terms of these small island states. And be really good to perhaps maybe afterwards just get a bit more information from Joseph or from yourself in terms of helping these SIDS address these barriers, because some of these barriers are very, very acute, very serious, and these require, I think, in trying to move these countries to useful project portfolios, one of the experiences that we've found is the need to actually help the countries to come up with some of these. I note in Joseph's presentation that while ambition is clear, identification of good, projects seems to be lacking, or if I've understood his presentation well, and that's a problem that we face as well. So one of the things we're trying to do is to try and how can we help the countries to develop those ideas, or translate the ambition rather into really good ideas. With these SIDS, there is a lack of all of these, many of the barriers that Joseph mentioned. So I think that there is a gap where I think we need to help these countries right at the beginning in designing these projects so that they fulfill the objectives of the GCF and comply with the requirements. But also, let's not forget the priorities of these countries, which is very, very important. I wanted to just touch on very interesting challenge that we faced at the beginning of this year. At the beginning of COVID in March, we had about 4 countries hit by a cyclone. So at the same time that we're trying to deal with COVID-19, they were hit by category 4 cyclone. And so it was a double whammy that faced these countries. And it was very, very difficult. You're trying to deal with COVID-19, but at the same time, you're trying to deal with the impact of cyclones. And so it created a lot of, it amplified the challenges, put it that way. So, I'm just trying to set the scene for my comments, but I thought I'll just add to what Joseph said by just highlighting exactly, the point about the impact of COVID, plus, cyclones and the usual, natural disasters. And we're now going into that period of time where we're now going to go back into our cyclone season, which is in the next couple of weeks. So, very, very important. But let me just say, what we have done as SPREP is that we have mobilized the Met services so that they are formally set up in what we call a Pacific Meteorological Council. So in the past, these Met directors met informally, did their own thing, but we managed to bring them together representation called the Pacific Meteorological Council, where they're able to meet every 2 years. And then to strengthen that further, we managed to establish a ministerial meeting that meets every 2 years. So every 2 years, the MIT directors have access politically to these ministers who obviously have influence over policy decisions in terms of financing and so forth. And then following on from that, we were able to then come up with a roadmap, a strategy in terms of what the priorities are for Met services in the region. And what PREP has done is to build on that. And now we have what is called a Pacific Met Desk, which is really a point of reference for partners that includes WMO, Australian Bureau of Meteorology, New Zealand Met, and all of these other partners that have this important role in supporting the work of SPREP. So that's helped the region to kind of move forward by providing these conduits where Met directors are able to come together, discuss policy, but also identify priorities. And they've done that through, as I mentioned, this roadmap of priorities. Just going back to Joseph's presentation on the NDCs, yes, there's a lot of projects or even some of the readiness where some countries are seriously looking at NDCs. NDCs is what we're focusing on right now because there's an obligation to report on that, as many of you are aware. And that's something that we've set up an NDC hub funded by a number of countries, and where we're working with other partners to help the countries develop their NDCs. And as Joseph mentioned in his presentation, quite a few of the countries actually linking that into the early warning system. So it's good to see that linkage between the NDC. But as I said, we've got a very good platform in the Pacific in terms of bringing together these key stakeholders. And through that, the Met directors and their various teams, that we expect them to then develop their plans in terms of getting that information. We're talking about information being made available to the different sectors or to government who then uses that information for various sectors. So that process and that system is there. It needs, of course, further strengthening in terms of getting that information, but it's packaging the information so that people are able to understand the information. Let's not forget that. We focus on access to information, getting information out. But one of the challenges we've found is actually getting people to understand what the information is. So very, very important. Let's not forget, it's not just access, it's not just getting the information out. It's using the information in a way that those people in those sectors, whether it's fisheries or agriculture, or people in general in terms of community, are able to understand that information. And we've done a lot of work where we work with broadcasting entities here in the region to try and retranslate that scientific information so that people are able to understand it. We sometimes forget that, but that's a very, very important aspect of access to information. I want to just stop there because I know I've probably run over time, but I thought I'd just mention those key points, and I'm happy to stay on and provide some further comments, but hopefully that's adequate at this point to get the discussion going. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joseph, for the presentation.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kosi. And indeed, that point of communicating to stakeholders with the language and the information that they can understand is absolutely critical. And also thanks for reminding us about the sort of double whammy that some of the countries in your region are now facing with both with COVID and with the cyclone season threatening. I'd like to say that one of GCF's responses to this whole pandemic situation has been to speed up the process for the readiness financing for countries, precisely to help in the prioritization and the preparation of projects for the pipeline. So the rapid readiness facility is now available, and it's precisely to enable countries to access that initial financing quickly to be able to advance projects. Joseph, I'm very conscious that we're running out of time. Would you like to respond to some of Kosi's points quickly before we hand over to the next section?
Yeah, thanks very much, Kosi, for the interesting observations. I think you've said it all. We definitely have ramped up our action to support countries and part of the COVID recovery process. And we have actively begun actively engaging countries at the origination state. Like Anya is saying, the readiness program is really targeted in helping countries to manage the COVID crisis and at the same time design and implement projects and bring them to the GCF. And so we take this very seriously, and our support has intensified, and we will work with you. We will definitely be there when you need us. We are putting together our sector guides, which should be finalized very soon. And once that is done, we will begin to have thematic dialogues and also country visits to make sure that we work together to articulate these ideas into project design. So we are really, really excited that the Pacific has already started doing a lot of things in this direction. And we will work with you to support you to meet your commitments. Thanks, over.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Thank you so much, Kosi, and particularly for staying up so late to talk to us. That was really incredibly valuable input from you. So without more ado, I'd like to hand over now to Ben Webster. Dr. Webster is the head of secretariat for the REAP, the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership. So over to you, Ben. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Anya, and thank you all for the invitation to attend. This is a fantastic opportunity, and we have some excellent panelists and speakers with us today. So as the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership, which was launched at the UN Climate Action Summit last year, we are seeking to bring together key stakeholders on this agenda from the climate community, from the humanitarian community, from the development community, states, governments, donors, so that we can really see some of this ambition and good practice that has been forming in past years translate into 1 billion people safer from disasters in the coming years. That's the target, that's the aim of the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership. And so it gives me great pleasure now to introduce a section where we can explore a specific example. So we've heard from Joseph vision, and we heard from Kosi some really helpful specifics around the Pacific context. And now we'd like to look at the context of Kenya and hear from some partners there from the Kenya Red Cross Society and the Kenyan Meteorological Department, and hear how this has worked in practice over recent years. So we have with us Emma Mwangi, who is the forecast-based financing lead researcher with the Kenya Red Cross Society. Welcome, Emma. And we also have Bernard Chanzu, who is Deputy Director for Climate Services at the Kenya Met Department. And Bernard has worked there for over 25 years. So 2 excellent people to have on board and to explain to us how some of this works in practice, in reality, on the ground. So Emma, perhaps we could start with you. Could you tell us a bit about the collaboration between Kenya Red Cross Society and the Kenya Met Department and how that has developed over recent years?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Ben, for the opportunity and the adaptation feature. So just to begin looking at how the collaboration has worked, and I think I'll pick from the point that the movement, the Red Cross movement, as well as Kenya Red Cross, is working towards implementing focus-based financing in Kenya for drought and floods. And for this, to enable us to do this, is that we brought together stakeholders from government institutions, including the Kenya Meteorological Department, just to help us unpack the climate information. What kind of early warning information exists within the department to be used as triggers, which thresholds are good enough to be used within the FBF system for us to trigger for floods and droughts. And I must say that collaboration has seen not only the capacity within Kenya Red Cross enhanced to unpack and interpret the focused information, but it's that within the technical working group that brings together stakeholders at the national level, that capacity has also been enhanced. And the previous speaker was saying that, yes, we need to unpack this technical information for it to be usable within the various sectors. Then over time, the Kenya Red Cross and TMD have worked hand in hand to disseminate early warning information. As you know, the Red Cross works to alleviate suffering amongst the most vulnerable. And once the forecast is issued by the Kenya Meteorological Department, it's that the Red Cross uses its TERI messaging platform to send this forecast to the most vulnerable communities. And this is not sent directly with using the English language, but it's unpacking that to Swahili, so that at least that person at the village level, that person at the most vulnerable community is able to get this information and be able to act on it. And then, as you all know, Kenya is also a devolved, we have a devolved system of government, and Kenya Red Cross and Kenya Meteorological Department they have officers at each of the counties. And what has been happening over time is that the Kenya Red Cross, as well as the Meteorological Department staff, have been working hand in hand to ensure that the counties, the county level governments, are first of all focusing on creating disaster risk management structures that are anticipatory and are able to bring in climate information and set aside some funding here, because disaster is a shared responsibility between the national and the county level there, so that the county level at that level they're able to handle the localized disasters before they're scaled up to the national level. When thinking about setting up early warning systems, it's that Kenya Red Cross and KMD have been in the recent past implementing projects jointly. For example, if I could look at the past 2 years, we've been focusing on setting up and enhancing flood early warning system in one of the basins in Kenya, in Tana River. And hopefully this will ensure communities that the communities, the government and institutions along that basin are able to access warning information about the river basin in time, and are also able to implement preparedness actions, because that's also being tied in with the policy. As we know, if we don't have an enabling policy environment, then this information will be actioned effectively. Yes, Ben.
Thanks, Emma. That's really helpful. So we've heard about involving the right stakeholders at the right time and ensuring there's an enabling policy environment. Bernard, perhaps we could turn to you and ask from the Kenya Met Department's perspective, how has this collaboration worked? And I'm also aware that there's a large research program called SHEAR, and under that there's a project called 4PAC where you've been collaborating together. So perhaps you could tell us how that has assisted the development of this relationship and the progress.
Thank you very much. I don't know, good afternoon, everybody. Is it afternoon where you are? Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I really appreciate to be given this opportunity to share some ideas on our collaboration with Red Cross. First of all, I have to say that Kenya Met Department has enjoyed a very good cordial relationship between with the Red Cross. That is for a very long time. What happens is KMD or Kenya Met Department, its mandate is actually to provide scientific information on climate. That is in terms of predictions of what is expected, and more so it is to do with the extreme events, which of course causes destruction. People are not well prepared. So Kenya Red Cross, through its mandate, it has been very useful to Kenya Met Department, because that most of our information before, long before, we used to just get information, and then we just make a general weather forecast. You are expecting heavy rains, you will just draw in the public that this is what is being expected. But in the past few years, as Emma has said, a lot has happened through various initiatives like what just Emma has been presenting. So you find that the relationship has really grown, whereby there has been a capacity building for both Kenya Met Department and also Red Cross, whereby through Red Cross, Kenya Red Cross, Kenya Met Department has come to appreciate and really recognize the need to provide actionable prediction. That is impact-based focus, focus which can be actioned. So that one has been achieved through working together with the Red Cross, whereby we've been able to understand the triggers and understand the let's say know what the people expect, or what information is needed to trigger action, and we through that we are able now to develop our forecast based on things which can be responded to. So Red Cross has gone even beyond that, to add on what Emma has just been saying, that it has really been on the forefront of ensuring that Kenya Met Department build the needed expertise. That is in terms of even trying to make sure that the skills the Kenya Met Department has improves in skills. So what has been happening is, through our relationship, we have been able to really understand our users' needs. We have been able to recognize and already start producing impact-based forecasting. And of course, it has really created confidence in our users, because what has happened is, through the projects like what you have referred to, the 4-pack, which is under the SHARE, this is a project which brought together, or which has been bringing together the agencies which are a response to risks, that is disaster agencies and other stakeholders in terms of early warning systems in weather-related or climate-related issues. So we have been working together such that we have done what we call co-production. That is the users and the producers like KMD, we've been sitting together, understanding the processes together, and coming up with the products, or coming up with packaged information which is acceptable to the user and which is actionable. So it has been the 4-pack, the project under SHARE has been very, very useful, and I think I can say that I think Kenya Met Department has really grown out of the collaboration with Red Cross. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernard. That's really helpful. And it sounds as if this collaboration has been over a period of time that you've really had to invest in this relationship and in the work. We shouldn't expect these things to just happen overnight. So I think that's a good lesson for other contexts. But as we think about how we can learn lessons from Kenya and hopefully replicate this in other places, what would you say are some of your recommendations? What have you learned through this journey? And what recommendations would you give for other contexts that might want to develop in this area as well? Emma, perhaps from your perspective, what would you say are your top pieces of advice?
I think that comes to mind is having worked closely with KMD and having collaborated, especially with the 4-pack project, is that the institutions that work with national meteorological services is that they need to advocate for for more financing for these organizations, and the financing will go in the human resource capacity as well as the infrastructure capacity, because we don't know if we need to improve early warning information. One thing that needs to go into it is better observations, and the countries need to improve their observation also. The other thing is in terms of the computing capacity, if we need to get localized information then from the National Meteorological Services, then there needs to be more financing going into the computing capacities. Then it's also for us to appreciate, I know Bernard has talked about it, the fact that we need to build trust in the information. And I think it starts from appreciating the Met services, interacting and engaging them more for us to move to a step where then we're able to trust the information that comes in. But also for the Met services, involving the users more in the process of co-production, because then you get to understand the needs of the users, you get to understand what information is more useful for their decision making. But ultimately, I would say a lot of advocacy, a lot of capacity building, as well as a lot of research going into the products that are useful for the different sectors. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Emma. That's really helpful. And Bernard, from your perspective, what recommendations or advice or tips would you give for other Met offices around the world embarking on this process?
Yeah, thank you very much. Emma has talked quite a lot into that line, but as our experience is that we realize that now information like climate information, which goes out, whenever you take it out, if it cannot trigger any action, then it becomes irrelevant. And so what I recommend is that Met services should really embrace that co-production, whereby they are always in touch with the users and the other stakeholders, so that whenever they are developing their products, they have information and they are able to actually articulate what the user needs. So another thing is you find that in Met services, like for our experience, most of them are being funded, like for Kenya Met Department, that be funded by the government. So you find most of the time the resources are normally very limited, and you find there is very little investment in terms of infrastructure and in even development of human capital. So what I can advise, the way we have seen from Red Cross, what Red Cross has done is that despite that, it has been coming in and even assisting Kenya Met Department to build the capacity in terms of skills. And you see, so other countries, what I could advise is they should really, meteorological services should really partner with such organization, so that they can be complemented. They get the development of their services is complemented by none other than the traditional government funding. So I think what we have learned from the collaboration is it is going to be very useful for any Met services to understand its user, for any of its information to be very meaningful. So that is what I can recommend to other Met services.
Thanks, Bernard. That's really helpful. And as ever, it sounds like Kenya is blazing a trail and really leading by example, which is fantastic. I've heard that we need to ensure there's a multi-stakeholder approach. I like this co-production term, which is us working together across the organizations, the sectors, the silos, so that we can bring in complementary roles and responsibilities. And as Kosi was mentioning, we can have climate information, early warning systems, finances. But if that's not linked to how do communities get empowered to take action based on the early warning systems or the alerts that come out, then all of this is to be wasted. So it all has to connect together, and that requires investment in advance and working around this pre-agreed system of what the triggers will be, what action will be taken, and ensuring that links to local communities on the ground. So thank you so much for your reflections. That's really helpful learning. Best of luck as you move this forward. And I hope that others have been able to take something out of that discussion. But Martin, can I hand over to you for the next section?
Great, thanks so much, Ben, and thanks, colleagues from Kenya. I hope you'll be able to stay on in the rest of the discussion because we'd like to hear more from you. Ben, I know you have to leave us because you're actually going to put all these thoughts into practice in, I think, a partnership on heat that you're going to be discussing. We're very fortunate to have someone like you with this network and insights in this role in this risk-informed early action partnership, which the IFRC is part of, but also the Green Climate Fund is part of, and many governments around the table here and further in the world are part of. We've got a lot of work to do to reach your 1 billion people, and I think the critical thing is to do it right. So I want to thank the two panelists that we've heard of already, and I think it's a nice bridge to the next set of panelists. So if I may invite them to join us now, and Ben, we know you have to go, so thank you very much for your contributions. So in the next panel, we have 3 people who have intimate knowledge, like we already heard from the Pacific and from Kenya, making these things happen on the ground. So the first is Ulrich Trotz, who I first met in the late 90s, already working on these issues in the Caribbean. He's currently the Deputy Director and Science Advisor for the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. Second, we have Jeremiah Sokan, the National Designated Authority for the Environmental Protection Agency in Liberia. So clearly also a country heavily affected and trying to make these things work on the ground to protect the country and its citizens from the growing risks. And finally, Dr. Julia dos Reis, the National Designated Authority at the State Secretariat for the Environment in Timor-Leste. So all 3, a very warm welcome. Before I turn to the 3 of you, I want to highlight once again that we have a collaborative note-taking document open for this session. The link is already in the chat, and a number of people have already identified their names there. We have a very distinguished audience, not just a wonderful set of panelists, but also a very rich and diverse set of participants, ranging from funders to researchers to communicators, to practitioners on the ground, and of course meteorological experts. So it's very nice already to see who else is in the room, and we want to make use of all your expertise. So as we're running through the panel, I'll roughly be following the structure that is in that Google Doc, and I'd like all of you to be able to not only share your questions that panelists might also be reflecting on, and I'll feed some of those things to them, but also your thoughts, because this collaborative note-taking document will also serve as part of the record of this panel discussion this afternoon, that you can all take forward yourself if you're investing in these areas, but certainly also will inform continued thinking, for instance, in the Green Climate Fund, as they're continuing to build their investment portfolio. But let me start with the panelists now. And the first question I just wanted to sort of throw out there as a starting point is, we're talking about climate information, early warning systems, but it comes against a context, right? We're worried about climate change, and we know the risks are rising. So can you say a few words about how in your countries the rising risks are being reflected, and how that translates into the need for investments in climate information and early warning systems? Shall we take them in the order that I introduced you? Ulrich, would you like to go first?
Hello, good morning. Yes, we are quite happy to be part of this discussion, because as a region, we place great emphasis on the need for an effective and functional multi-hazard early warning system. And we are quite pleased to see the GCF initiative in this direction. In the Caribbean, we have a very unique situation. There are several bits and pieces basically that are required for a functional multi-hazard early warning system across the Caribbean, but they are not coordinated. We are now in the process of basically taking stock of what we have, what are the elements present in the Caribbean that would contribute to comprehensive MHEWS system. We're looking at where there are gaps, the essential gaps we have to fill. We are also looking at the type of coordination that is required across the region to ensure that the messages basically that are now being turned out by our institutions basically gets to the right people. Interestingly enough, we've just completed in the Caribbean an exercise which was led very ably by our sister institution, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, the WMO designated climate center for the Caribbean, by SEDEMA, or disaster management organization, of course backed up by WMO and the Caribbean Meteorological Organization, and the other relevant organizations in the Caribbean. And we now do have a roadmap, 2020 to 2030, basically for the establishment of a comprehensive and practical MHEWS system in the Caribbean. So this conversation is very timely, and no pun intended. We are giving early warning to the GCF that we'll be approaching them to help us to implement that roadmap. We have problems. The thing in the Caribbean is we are many sovereign countries, small states, and our approach is regional for implementation, taking into consideration the requirements of all of the member states. Our approach has always been to have some appreciation of the fact that in our small countries, there are serious capacity challenges. And as a result, we have to look at a regional mechanism for enabling countries to implement and to be part of that network. I'll stop there for the moment and hope to make some other remarks later. Martin, I'm not hearing you.
Letting me know. Thank you for letting me know. Trying to reduce the background noise, but it's a good reminder. Thank you for those opening remarks, and we will be coming back to you because there's a rich experience in the Caribbean, I know, and I think it's reflected partly in what you said about the collaboration between those different institutions on this agenda, and the fact that the climate finance world, including the Green Climate Fund, is being informed also by the experiences on the meteorological center side, and in this case, the disaster management side, is of course critical. And it's really encouraging. I think the Caribbean and the Pacific have in some ways sort of explored that territory for much longer than many other countries that are just starting that journey. So there's a lot to learn also from your experience. But thank you for now. Let's turn to Liberia. Mr. Jeremiah Sokan, are you with us? If you're with us, we cannot hear you. Hope it's not an issue with the microphone or the video. Otherwise, let's shift yet another continent and go to Timor-Leste. Dr. Julia dos Reis, are you with us?
Martin, good evening. Yes,
Excellent. We also see a camera turning on now. We cannot yet see your face. It might be directed elsewhere if you have a chance to move the camera around, but we do hear you as well.
let me work this thing. It may not be working, but at least you can hear me, right? I think that's
We
the
hear you
most.
well.
I don't have a nice background as what we have at the back, so I'm just at home right now. Good evening to you all across the world. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I hope that the COVID situation, you and your families are safe and sound and stay away from the COVID-19. Here in Timor-Leste, of course, but before I start, I'd like to thank Dr. Joseph Insitful's presentation, and also reflecting on Cozy from Scrap in terms of his intervention regarding the knowledge and plans that you may put together. Sometimes may not work if it's not properly shared with the locals and stuff. With Timor-Leste, of course, we as a country, we appreciate very much the initiative in which GCF has in terms of allocating necessary funding to support with early warning system planning and so on. Unfortunately, with us, at times it can be difficult to really engage with the government, with different ministries, to be able to take into account why it is important to address the issue of climate change, specifically in relation to early warning system. But of course, in recent, a couple of months back, with a bushfire that really damaged at least 3,000 hectares of our coffee plantations. And that has been an eye-opening for the government to realize that what we have been preaching over the years about having important information in terms of early warning system, working with the communities and so on, is really important, because knowing the fact that by the estimated calculation of coffee plantation that was damaged as a result of the fire was almost about $16 million US, and that is and this is a coffee plantation that has been passed down from generations, and this is a major loss for the country, not only for the people at the community level, but at the same time for the country as a nation to respond to its people at the community level. And so through the disaster which we face, and the government comes to realize that this is an important thing, and from the National Designated Authority of the Green Planet Fund, we have worked closely with the key ministries relevant to these areas to make sure that they allocate necessary funding. And also, at times they understand that GCF has the fund for that. Why would they not allocating fund to support us in these areas? But of course, at times we do let them know that in the government, ensuring that they understand that the GCF fund is a complementary fund. It is not something that GCF will allocate to solve the problems in the country. But of course, that needs regular discussions for them to understand, to be able to take into account, take into consideration to allocate necessary funding for the initiative going forward, given the fact that it is an important issue that the government needs to take into its own hand and stuff. But of course, appreciation goes to GCF for such initiative that will be helpful in the future, given that we have just submitted one of our proposals that is going to really enhance these areas big time in the future. I'll pass to you, Martin, and I'll stand by for further discussion going forward.
Great, thank you so much. Because your question partly also brings us quite logically to the next question. And by the way, may I invite people again to follow the Google link and look at the document. One thing, it's critical that we have clarity on what the needs are and where the gaps are and where the investment needs are. And you've clearly already been doing great work on that in Timor-Leste. It's also very useful for countries to share that information. Paul de Senker was mentioning from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat. was mentioning in the Google Doc already that there are initiatives to map this sort of information. He was asking about this information specifically for LDCs, but also noting that there's an exchange happening between the NAPs. So those of you interested, feel free to contact him. His contact details are in the Google Doc. Besides identifying the gaps, I guess there's also the question of why the gaps aren't being filled. And to some extent, that brings us to a next segment of questions I'd like to go to, which is the sort of the business case for this investment. And that business case can have a very private meaning, but can also have a very public meaning in terms of what the payoff is of investments in this sort of climate information early warning system from a perspective of the broader climate objectives that we have, in the end, the sustainable development objectives that we have, but also, for instance, the Paris Agreement goals, including the adaptation goal there. So there's a question of coherence and complementarity of investments. How do information and early warning system investments fit a broader pattern of investments of a country at large? But also, what do these investments in climate information early warning systems yield? What is the return on investment? And I noted already a number of really interesting examples there of what's already there and can be leveraged, but also some examples of the impact that can have in the Google document. So please, anyone, I know, again, there's a lot of expertise around, please keep adding that. But let's go back to our panelists first. I know we're still waiting for the National Designated Authority from Liberia. So hopefully he'll come online soon and we'll be able to go back to him for all the questions. For now, may I go back to you, Ulrich, and hear a Caribbean perspective, the business case for investments in these sorts of systems, which by some people are sometimes sort of considered a luxury or a sort of public good that doesn't immediately yield benefits, that is sort of out there for the interest of the climate community or the meteorological community. Now, coming from the Red Cross, and we heard the examples from Kenya, we know how critical it is to have these systems in place. But I guess it's also important for governments to clarify that case, and I guess for the Green Climate Fund to hear that demand expressed clearly. So in the Caribbean, I guess, well, there's hardly a region, I guess, where that business case could not be clearer in terms of the value of being able to anticipate risks and reduce them over time, rather than keep being hit. But I'm sure you've got more to share on that question. So how do we even better present that business case, and what does that require from all of us in terms of working together to present that to the world?
Martin, for us, I don't think it's difficult to make a business case for EWS, for CIEWS in the Caribbean. A recent World Bank report showed that we suffer at about $1.2 billion loss to natural disasters each year. So I think it's pretty set in the minds at the political level right throughout the communities that we need to invest in these systems. Unfortunately, like most adaptation interventions, this up to now, I think, is looked on as a public good. And so when you talk about a business case, etc., that seems to be alien language when referring to providing people with this type of service. But I think the time is ripe for us to move that. We are very anxious to move that envelope. A couple of things at the systemic level. Our governments are still in the frame of mind that hydrometeorological services basically have no contribution to development or to what we're talking about this morning. They haven't made that connection. Traditionally, our Met offices in the Caribbean have been there to service the aviation industry. And there's not that awareness of the important role that meteorology plays in national development, and certainly in terms of providing us with some sort of safety havens to deal with the disasters we face year in and year out. I think we would like to see GCF as a partner at the table when we are discussing this issue with our governments. I think having the GCF at the table lends some credence to the issues that we are putting forward and would move that, would accelerate the appreciation at that level of the need for investment. The other issue has to deal with the business, how do we transform, but I'm thinking now particularly of the Met services, how do we transform their business, their approach to business models. Here again, I think that the GCF can offer the region a tremendous amount of insight and help in moving us into that direction. A couple of our Met offices, the one in Guyana I know, is now trying to move in that direction and move from, you know, the shackles of being ministry bound with all of the restrictions that would place on what we're talking about. So again, too, we feel that once we start to get that transformation, more importantly, it would attract our private sector into this sector as they look at it as an investment sector. So those two are critical. And as we're talking about finance, in the region, there's quite a lot of support from international donor organizations for investment in our work under this umbrella, but it's not coordinated. For one thing, we have the old problem of some of our countries being designated as middle-income countries, so they don't qualify for support. So there's a kind of balkanization of effort across the region. And I think here again, I will be bold enough to suggest for the region that I would like to see a GCF-led donor conference in the Caribbean that would look at donor coordination to help us to roll out the roadmap that we've spent the last couple of years putting together. So the environment basically becomes one where all are familiar with where we want to go, and all of the resources basically would be channeled towards helping us to achieve that objective. But it's a culture, as I say, we have it's not only with this particular activity, but certainly with anything to do with adaptation. The feeling is that adaptation is for the government, you know, your sea defenses, etc. That is a government obligation, etc. So the private sector hasn't been involved, and making a business case basically for this investment is a critical stepping stone if we are going to move forward to put in place the systems that we need to put in place.
Thanks, Ulrich. Julia, may we hear your perspective from Timor-Leste?
Now you can see me.
Indeed, great.
Yeah, Timor-Leste, let me be clear in this. This is not a luxury or public good. If we are not allocating necessary funding for the early warning system, then as a country, we do not think that DCF is really serving its purpose. It's primary objective of allocating the fund. Because the thing is, with the early warning system being put in place, the life of many marginalized groups will be affected as a consequence of this. So for DCF to allocate necessary funding is important because it is responding to the needs of many across the world that are affected as a result of having poor planning put in place. But of course, what is important is to note that for these kind of interventions to be successful, it is important to ensure that it is implemented accordingly to serve the needs of the people at the community level. For instance, perhaps to identify the vulnerable spots across the region, and also work with the locals and approach them how they will be able to really understand what is needed of them in terms of ensuring that they understand what is put in place. If we were to have comprehensive and practical planning, ensure that those people understand it in the process so that they will be able to implement it accordingly, or having some things that ensure that to prevent them from being affected by this kind of disasters. And so we believe that by having allocated necessary funds for early warning system, we will be able to reduce economic loss that countries will face. And this will also directly impact on the loss of the cost of loss and damage, which is one of the most important things that we discuss every year in COP, because the loss and damage associated with poor early warning system being in place is going to be huge. And so to put necessary funding to prevent things before happening is much more important than having to deal with the consequences as we go. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much. That's really insightful. I hear we also have our colleague from Liberia, Jeremiah, on the panel now. Jeremiah, can you hear me? Okay, I'll ask the organizers to see if there is still something with microphone rights. If not, we'll keep working on that. Jeremiah, if you can hear us, we cannot yet hear you. Okay, well, let's keep going then. There was one element that also came back in one of the questions around this framing of a business case, and also the question of private sector involvement. So let me read out that question from Mark Harvey of Resurgence. What are some of the risks in engaging the private sector, especially in relation to early warning information provision, given that the National Meteorological and Hydrological Services have a national mandate in this area, and confusion could be caused by private actors issuing alerts independently of public agencies? Anything either from the Caribbean or from Timor-Leste you'd want to share, or also from the Kenyan perspective, either from the Kenyan Meteorological Department or from Kenya Red Cross? Ulrich, you were quite vocal about the need to involve the private sector more. Are there also risks?
Yes, I don't think we are exposed to that type of danger at this point in time in the Caribbean, in that there is no capacity at the level of private sector to, at least around the Caribbean, to be in a position to generate information that they can then disseminate. For one thing, most of the platforms for that type of dissemination are fairly well established at a regional level, with the authority for dissemination at the regional level, say in disaster risk reduction with SEDEMA, and nationally with the national disaster management offices. So I think we have a pretty well-structured way of getting information out and it would be, I don't see the private sector coming in at that level. What is a challenge basically in the Caribbean is that, and we're trying to address it, is getting different publics to understand how much their daily decisions depend on some climate information. And this, once we get over that hurdle, I think we are now starting to generate a market for that information. In terms of the private sector, they are now starting to realize that the sort of information that we generate at the different time scales is certainly critical for their operations. They're starting to see how use of this information redounds to the success of what they're involved in. So we are the bottom ladder of this process, and I think we will be able to manage that risk that you referred to in terms of the authority basically to sort of get information out to the different publics. We have a pretty well-structured organization in place, and I don't see that being undermined by private sector coming into the fold.
Great. So I hear a complementary model with, on the one hand, very clear public mandate for the provision of the sort of the classical early warnings for public safety that Mark is also referring to in his question, but then also the more tailored information that allows businesses to optimize their own operations, and in that sense, in the end, also reduce losses or maximize profits. Where clearly the business case would be much easier to define as well, also at a private level. Any additional insights from Timor-Leste on this question, Julian?
Yes, Martin. At the perspective of Timor-Leste, we do know that the private sector at this stage, having the country just having independence for just 20 years, we don't have many private sectors that are of course found in the country. But of course, those that are existing in the country, they have the best interest for the country, for what we know, and so their involvement in terms of ensuring to implement the policies, the regulations of the country at the local level has always been very important, given that the government is lacking of human resources and capacities to be able to respond to everything within the country. So our private sector's involvement in the country's development and overseeing, involvement in addressing issues associated with the early warning system has been outstanding as far as I'm concerned. So we understand that they have an important role to play in the country's development. Being said, so that their existence, if the country is developing in a way that is positive, then of course it has direct impact also in their operation. So they always have the best interest ensuring that everything is put in place according to whatever plans we have. And so as far as I'm concerned, the private sector's involvement has been great, and we understand that it is in their best interest to support the country in many different ways if possible.
Great, thank you. I'm just checking back if we have Jeremiah already able to speak on the panel.
No.
Still not. Okay, if I may ask the if I may ask the webinar hosts to keep an eye out for it and make sure he is not automatically muted as an audience member. Then let's continue to a next question. So that there's one question much more generally. I already mentioned Paul de Senker's earlier point about the repositories also for this sort of information, the importance of sharing it. But he's asking also, what is there a sort of general approach possible where if we feel that this needs to be something that every country has as a backbone for their efforts on climate adaptation, shouldn't it essentially be a standard investment in all LDCs and SIDS rather than waiting for countries to develop their proposals and prepare them through a pipeline, for instance, for the GCF? Isn't it something that should just be sort of standard practice everywhere? I guess you are giving examples of regions and countries where these investments have already been made, so you've been going through that. But has it taken effort and time to go through that process of developing those demands? And was that time well spent to articulate those demands more clearly, or is there something that we now basically know enough about to be able to roll it out, for instance, starting with all LDCs and SIDS, sorry, least developed countries and small island developing states? Ulrich, would you like to comment on that?
What one has to realize, like here in the Caribbean, many of our member states, as I said, I mentioned, their capacity challenges. And how we approach it is that the member states invest as much in the system that allows them to draw the information from the regional sort of from the regional systems that are in place. So it's a two-way feed. In terms of informing the regional system, there's a minimal amount of same monitoring facilities that need to be in each member state. So that's what we are working out. For instance, if we are looking at a rainfall grid for the Caribbean, it means that each member state would have to have rain gauges disposed at critical areas to inform that regional system. So we're in a mindset that many of the requirements, basically at the national level, are being provided through a regional mechanism, and that basically helps countries not to have to make that investment with each country, with every single bit of equipment and with their own sort of IT systems, etc. The national systems are designed to be part and parcel of a regional delivery system, and I think that's basically the only way we can move forward.
Great, thanks. I want to also maybe before coming to Timor-Leste and hear additional perspectives also on this question, maybe tie it in with another question from Becky Venton, who is asking, so you were pointing, Ulrich, to the sort of transversal needs and the pieces every country needs to have in place, but also the need for embedding that in a regional system. I think she's asking also about enablers further down, right? So data sharing needs to be improved across the hydromet domain at all levels and for all institutions. And it would be good to see more balance of funding across the whole value chain. So not just investment in infrastructure and training, but much, much more on the development of sustainable products and services for vulnerable communities. Can you say a bit more about how you're balancing those different elements of the investments in the Caribbean and how you see the packages being formulated to have that whole value chain incorporated?
Well,
in Timor-Leste?
I think we have an excellent example here in the Caribbean with the the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology. They now, for instance, work with user groups. The major ones at the moment are in the health sector, the tourism sector, of course, the agricultural sector, and very recently and interesting, the energy sector, because they are now aware of how important climate information is for their functionality and for their operation. So there are these stakeholder meetings. And the reason for the different stakeholder meetings is for the stakeholders basically to define what sort of information they require, for the stakeholders to define how that information is to be packaged so that it would be in a user-friendly form, and how basically it's going to be disseminated. So these are very active networks. And as a result, there is a two-way exchange of information with institutions at one level and with the stakeholders at the other level, that they make sure that the information that is generated, is information that they understand and that they can use. And they have in place mechanisms using things like smartphones, etc., to get information out to the farmer, for instance, and to every single operator that would need climate information to perform their duties. So I think we have a pretty good example of how we address this issue. You know, it's an old issue that, yes, your institutions are doing well, they're generating excellent information, but who uses it? Is the information really making a difference? Is it reaching the right people? Is it basically resulting in the types of action that you'd like to see across the different landscapes? So yes, we are paying very much a great deal of attention to this issue.
Thank you very much, and I think it very much dovetails with what Joseph was sharing earlier, also on this move in the hydromet community towards providing more impact-based forecasting that is more tailored to the impacts that the stakeholders are worried about, and then also to facilitating that early action, also indeed in those local communities that Becky was mentioning in her question. Can we hear from Timor-Leste maybe? Is it similar for you? How do you make sure the investments in climate information early warning systems really reach local communities, for instance?
Martin, I agree with a colleague of mine who has just mentioned about the approach, the importance of having the information within the community in need more, because we don't want to invest a lot of money in certain things, then it ends up in our storage room without having an impact on the community level. So it is quite important to ensure that whatever planning is put in place is communicated in a manner that will really reach the communities who are most vulnerable at this stage. And so in Timor-Leste, of course, we do have this kind of system that we put in place to ensure that the system triggers the early warning system, that the message is getting to the communities that need to know what is happening, for them to be able to communicate and being aware of what is happening. Like, for instance, throughout the day, maybe at 12 o'clock in some areas, the heat goes up to 40 degrees or so, then the system, sending a message to the community to say, being aware, because there is a likely change of fire and stuff, so that the community are aware of this kind of things. But of course, mentioning about the regional system being put in place, it's important now for countries to be able to learn for their neighbors, for the brothers and sisters, of course, across the globe, which is important for information sharing, the best system that others can perhaps adopt to be able to help with the situation at the local level. But of course, also, it is important to keep in mind that countries that have their own requirements, their mechanisms that they have put a national level of how best they allocate the fund. And so these kind of things need to put into to take into consideration given the differences between one country to the other. But of course, coming up with a system that is uniform across all countries in the world is also making it easier for all of us. I hope that in some ways, if it helps make our job much easier, even the circumstances that countries like Timor-Leste and others as a disease facing in terms of lack of human resources and capacities, it's always good to be able to learn from each other and having one step ahead of time by learning from others. So this is important. Just that need to take note of certain things that is put in place by the country in its own. Over to you, Martin.
Great, thank you so much. Joseph, I know you're still online. You're technically not on this panel, but I guess in a way people will be curious how Green Climate Fund is looking at this and also how you look at this question of this whole value chain. You said a few words about it already in your introductory remarks in your presentation, but do you want to respond to this at all?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think it's very important, as you've said, to look at the value chain. The weakest point in the value chain is the weakest within the link, and we need to address all of the elements of the value chain. In the context of forecast-based financing, I think is one of the best ways that we can reach the most vulnerable. And one of the participants asked the notion of leaving no one behind. For forecast-based financing blended with climate information services project, you ensure that the last mile is automatically guaranteed, where you blend in the early action bit through impact-based forecasting blended with the forecast-based financing interventions to reach everybody within the community. So for me, that is the best way to design climate information and early warning systems project. As a matter of fact, within GCF, one of the resort areas that is critical to our mandate is the most vulnerable population and their livelihoods. And so early warning, early action, climate information services is a natural way of reaching the most vulnerable. And so we ensure that projects that are looking at even modernization of hydromet services has a component of the last mile where we could bring in the IFRC, WFP, and others, the Disaster Management Agency, to make sure that the information that are produced or will be produced by the hydromet services leads to last mile delivery. So if you look at our project in the Philippines, where they are looking at impact-based forecasting, forecast-based financing, this has become the type of architecture that we recommend. A similar project is being designed for Liberia, and then also a UNEP 5 multi-country program that will target countries of the Pacific. And so this is becoming the new approach where we will ensure that no one is left behind, and the information that is generated by the hydromet services feeds into the preparedness and the early action elements of the Disaster Management Agency, and then the IFRC, WFP, and other humanitarian agencies on the ground. But I would also like to address the issue of establishing the utility of climate information and early warning services. It is becoming very clear if you look at the issue of rainfed agriculture in developing countries. If you take sub-Saharan Africa, about 70% of the population depend on rainfed agriculture. And the ability to predict the onset and cessation of the rainy season is becoming very, very complicated. So our intervention then goes to inform the farmers in terms of when to plant, what is the length of the growing season, the onset of a disease, what will be the implication on post-harvest losses, and also the shifts in planting seasons. And this definitely provides an opportunity to secure the lives and the livelihoods of the 70%, over 70% of the population that depend purely on rainfed agriculture. Another area that I think could support in terms of private sector is look at areas like aviation. It's well established in Africa through ASECNA and other agencies. The aviation meteorology actually is a very good business. I mean, if you could leverage the investment that we are making, looking at areas within the private sector, like aviation, like shipping, logistics, and also agriculture, it becomes very clear where revenue streams can be generated, where you can attract the private sector to participate in this very important endeavor. And so we envisage that blended finance could be one of the routes where countries can bring in the private sector to build a more comprehensive and integrated approach to addressing the issue of climate risk. And when it is done in this way, you're able to mobilize enough finance to support this type of investment. As I said in my presentation, it's well established that for every dollar of investment, you get in terms of returns $2 to $36, or even more in terms of returns. And this is a serious case for private sector to get involved. We've seen a number of private sectors in Africa, and most of the hydromet services are going towards the PPP or revenue cost recovery as part of the architecture. And so I think this is the way forward. Private sector definitely has to be part of the equation. And this can be done in a way that does not pose a threat to the existence of the hydromet services. There is an area that the hydromet services are very good at. Other areas, they will need the private sector to come in. Packaging of the information, reaching the last mile, developing new products that is relevant to private sector. We need a different set of skills that the hydromet services don't have. And so this is the way I think we should think in terms of how we can leverage those investments that are coming into the countries to enable them to leverage more financing to drive uptake and investment in climate information and early warning systems. For instance, the project that Liberia and AFDB have submitted to us, it looks at how to establish kind of a trust fund that will ensure that sustainability and upscaling of those investments are made possible. So they are looking at aviation industry in terms of access to radar systems and the tools and methods that will enable them to provide aviation meteorology. They are looking also at the marine sector. They are looking at the whole private sector as an area where they could leverage finance to sustain those investments that we are making at the end of the life cycle of the project. So I think there is a wide range of opportunities out there, and GCF is ready to help countries to think through in terms of how to translate these ideas into action through projects. And we'll work with you to work out and bring in more partners. And for the Caribbean, we would definitely be happy to support you to make the business case to the government and also coordinate the donor intervention on the continent. Thanks, over.
Thank you so much. I think we're running towards the end of the panel, but this was almost, first of all, filling the gap for our colleague from Liberia, who unfortunately couldn't join us. Also mentioning what I was going to ask of the two colleagues from Kenya, who unfortunately already had to leave as well, around innovative financing mechanisms that connect what we get out of the early warning systems to that action, especially also in the most vulnerable places in communities. And you mentioned the complementary role of investments in impact-based forecasting and early warning systems with systems like forecast-based financing, where there is then an automatic release of finance for the early actions that are triggered by the early warnings. So I think that's a very exciting development, and indeed one we're also collaborating on in several countries, including the ones you mentioned before, where I indeed hope we're establishing models of on the one hand, increased investment in this overall agenda. On the other hand, the business models to also attract the private sector, but also the government investments that are needed here. And we see the Green Climate Fund coming to the fore already on a very big scale. But then thirdly, also making that connection to the whole range of actors to make sure that that last mile is also reached. And we're very happy and proud to be collaborating with you on that. And I think that was on full display this afternoon. So thank you for that, Joseph. Also, thank you very much for your contributions from the Caribbean and from Timor-Leste. And before that, from Kosi from the Pacific and from our colleagues from Kenya. One thing that is clear is that this is an issue that affects richer and poorer countries around the world that were already facing the dire need of a bigger investment in this, and that the Green Climate Fund is there to work with this wide range of partners to get it right. And I think also coming back to Adaptation Futures, that then brings us to that beautiful bridge of science, policy, and practice, where the biggest progress can happen. And it's really nice to see that so strongly reflected in this afternoon's panel. I just want to then maybe hand over for some final words to Anya and the final organizers, but not without thanking my colleague Catalina Jaime, who has been working hard also behind the scenes on getting this all lined up. So thank you, Catalina. And Anya, thank you for the great partnership. And Joseph, of course, organizing this afternoon, and to the organizers for hosting us. But Anya, a few final words from you maybe before we hand back to TERI. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Martin, for your brilliant facilitation of this panel. And it's really been an incredible privilege to hear from colleagues working on climate information early warning systems right across the world, in Kenya, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific region. So thanks very much to all the panelists, and thanks so much to the participants for all the questions and comments that you've sent in. It's going to be really great to keep in touch with you. Let's keep this discussion going. Please keep in touch with GCF. In the context of the private sector discussions that we've been having, the next event that GCF is going to be hosting online is going to be the GCF Private Investment for Climate Conference. So all about the private sector from the 14th to the 16th of October. You can just Google GPIC 2020 and you'll find it. Please do join us for this GPIC conference, and we can have some more discussions specifically focusing on these issues of accelerating private sector involvement in climate action. Thank you so much to the IFRC and to Martin and Catalina for the partnership in working and developing this whole session tonight. Good night, everyone. And now to close, I would like to hand over to Juhi Bansal from TERI for the final comment. Thank you. Over.
Thank you so much, Anya. On behalf of the hosts, TERI and WASP, I'd like to thank all the panelists for the extremely informative discussion on forecasting the future, and to the participants for their questions and comments that stimulated this rich discussion. I would like to thank GCF and Red Cross once again for organizing this insightful webinar. We're grateful for this opportunity to have heard from some of the leading experts in the field of climate change adaptation during the course of this webinar, as well as over the last the other 2 days over this webinar series, with participants joining in from across the globe. The learnings from these webinars will be collated in the form of proceedings, and they'll be shared along with the recordings on our website in due course. Please keep checking our website for updates in this regard, as well as an upcoming blog series and future webinars as well. Last but not least, we'd like to reiterate our thanks for the continued support and patronage of our sponsors, which is critical for the success of Adaptation Futures 2020, given the unprecedented state of affairs. Thank you all for your time, and stay safe.